what Vanderbilt did, he went to the Norwich and Worcester Railroad up in Connecticut and said, you guys pay for finishing the steamboat, and we'll use it to compete against the Long Island Railroad, and we'll put them out of business instead. So that's exactly what happened. The Long Island Railroad actually created its own competition and physically created its own competition in the form of that steamboat Atlantic. So the Long Island Railroad now had a competition against itself from its own steamboat. Okay? So what does this tell you? Well, there's an old saying in the 19th century, don't change horses in midstream. And that's exactly what they did. They wimped out and didn't follow Vanderbilt's plan, and they destroyed themselves essentially. So now they had no more revenue coming in from the route between New York and Boston, and that's where all their profit was coming from. Their profit margin was coming from the interstate railroad traffic. The local traffic on Long Island and Brooklyn was just barely enough to cover the operating costs, which is what their original business plan calculated, but now without the Boston route, they're totally screwed. So in 1850, they went bankrupt, and some speculators and scrap metal guys from Philadelphia bought the Long Island Railroad at the sheriff's auction. And the first thing they did was they tried to reinstitute the rail connection between Brooklyn and Boston, but it was already too late to do this because that market niche was already taken over by other companies. Then the second thing they wanted to do was patch up the track along the route between Brooklyn and Greenport because the rails were falling apart. Why? Because of the trains going 60 miles an hour, they overstressed the primitive cast iron rails that they used to use back then. You see, nowadays, the rails that we have in the subway, for example, are made of a special alloy that's hard on the outside and soft on the inside. So they didn't have this back in the 1840s, so the rail they used was just cast iron, which is inherently very brittle. So a lot of times the locomotive would be chugging along and find a weak spot in the rail and open it up. And what would happen would be the rail would crack underneath the locomotive's main wheels. And being that the locomotive was real heavy, it would press down on the end of the rail. This means the other end of the rail would pop upwards like a seesaw, and it would come through the floor of one of the passenger cars and impale somebody, and that was called getting the snakehead. Considered to be one of the acceptable hazards of using trains back in those days. So people just ate it. Now, what happens, also there were some people who were killed in this tunnel, by the way. There were about half a dozen people documented who died down here. Some during its construction, other ones were people who were walking from one car to the next car while the train was moving. You know how they have that sticker in the subway on the storm doors that says don't walk through moving cars? Well, these people did. And they fell in between the cars and got cut into 3 neat sections by the train wheels. And that happens with several people. So going back to 1846, you have ghost stories in this tunnel originating in the newspaper articles from back in those days, starting in the year 1846. Anyway, getting back to the storyline, the railroad just barely hung in there, and slowly it began to make a profit again, except the people who owned the railroad always filed a phony financial statement with the state saying it was just breaking even, so that way they wouldn't have to pay taxes. So they filed it as breaking even, but in reality it made money. I plotted out their profit and loss and their operating expenses, and I got a nice trapezoidal shape, you know, for a profit margin up on top of the business curve. So it was making money, but they lied about it. Now what happened was, in the 1850s, the early 1850s, the Litchfield brothers became very active. Now, there were 4 Litchfield brothers, and originally they were railroad developers from the Midwest, but they lost all their money in the recession in 1837, and they moved to New York. And then a couple of them moved to Brooklyn. Now, originally, they had a law firm, and they also had a company in Dumbo on Water Street, where they would take whale oil and make it into lighting fluid for people to use in their homes, and they would also make candles there for people's home lighting. Now, around 1850, the gas company first showed up. So anybody who had any money for it wanted gaslight because it was so much better over candles or whale oil, and it was a lot safer too. So all of a sudden, Litchfield's whale oil company and his candle factory is not worth much anymore because nobody wants the stuff. So what does he do like a good businessman? Well, he goes out and insures it for 10 times more than what it's worth with 10 different insurance companies who don't know about each other. And then on a Sunday afternoon, there's a mysterious fire, and the whole thing burns to the ground. The next day, Litchfield puts an ad in the local paper, and what it says between the lines is, "Dear volunteer fire department, thanks for not coming to the fire yesterday. I'll take care of you the next time you have your fundraiser." So that's what happened to that. Now, he got the money for the insurance. The insurance paid off. And he took the money and bought the Jacques Corteliu farm and made Park Slope out of it. That's where Park Slope came from, and that's where he got the money from to buy the land. He went out and got the money through insurance fraud and went into the real estate business. So it's going to be a long trail of frauds. Wait until you hear what comes up next. Now, nobody wanted to move into Park Slope except for mosquitoes who lived there. Why? Because it was literally a swamp area. So the Litchfields, being transportation people, got the idea that maybe if they built a horse-drawn streetcar line to run from the ferry landings along Furman Street into Park Slope, maybe people would then move into Park Slope. And it worked. People began to move in once they built their horse-drawn streetcar line, which picked up passengers from the Fulton Street Ferry, the Montague Street Ferry, and the Atlantic Avenue Ferry. Now, the reason I mentioned ferries is because back in those times there were no bridges over the East River yet. All they had were ferries. Now, the Litchfields said to themselves, maybe we can make lightning strike twice and make money by building a copy of the Champs-Élysées along Atlantic Avenue. Now, keep in mind that Atlantic Avenue was a little bit more developed by the mid-1850s, and it was semi-built up to Flatbush Avenue. But east of Flatbush Avenue, it was still just mostly the woods. So what the Litchfields wanted to do was take the Long Island Railroad's right-of-way, throw them out of Brooklyn, and make their right-of-way into an extension of Atlantic Avenue. And at the same time create their own horse-drawn streetcar line that would run up this extension of Atlantic Avenue out to Jamaica. Now, there were a couple of things that stood in their way. First of all, they needed some money to go and acquire the real estate. Then they also needed to get rid of the Long Island Railroad. So this is what they did. The Litchfields went to the property owners and told them that they're going to build this project called the Atlantic Avenue Promenade and Drive. And if you want to know what it's supposed to look like, look at our website, brooklynrail.net. On the tunnel page, we have an architectural drawing from 1859 that shows what it was supposed to look like. But to make a long story short, Eastern Parkway and Ocean Parkway were copied off the same plans like 25 years later. So it was supposed to basically look like Eastern Parkway or Ocean Parkway. So what happened was they got everyone all agitated in the area to have this boulevard built. So then Litchfield, using his political connections, got a law put through the state legislature in Albany in 1859 called the Tunnel Act, which said that underground tunnels and locomotives in the city of Brooklyn are a public nuisance, and that a new tax district is hereby established, and all the people who live in this tax district have to pay money to Litchfield for removing the tunnel. So here's what Litchfield did. He went to the Long Island Railroad and said, hey, you're about to get kicked out of Brooklyn and you're going to have nothing. But you know what? I'm not such a bad guy. I'm going to make a deal with you. I'm going to build you a branch railroad that's going to go from Jamaica to Long Island City. And then you're going to have a new ferry run from Long Island City to Manhattan. And you're going to bypass Brooklyn completely, and you're going to give me your rights to Atlantic Avenue. So the railroad went along with it. And the Litchfield built this connecting railroad called the New York and Jamaica. Now, what it did was it ran from Jamaica, from their main station at Jamaica, to a place called Winfield Junction in Queens, where it connected up to a pre-existing railroad called the Flushing Railroad, which Litchfield had taken over because it was bankrupt. And the line then went down the Flushing Railroad alongside of Newtown Creek into Long Island City to Borden Avenue. And that's where the connection to Hunters Point came from. At the same time, Litchfield was given the rights by the Long Island Railroad to Atlantic Avenue. That made him eligible to collect the money for demolishing this tunnel. So, as you can see, it's not very demolished, is it? So right now, we're standing inside of a monument to 19th century political corruption. So all Litchfield did was plug up the entranceways and cap off the air shafts and have his buddies write up some phony reports saying that the whole thing was destroyed. So that's how he got the money. So he took the money from the people who lived around here, and if you didn't have cash to pay this guy, he took your land instead, which is what he wanted anyway. Now, what he did was really bad. He collected up all his money, okay, and then closed up the entrances to the tunnel, but then he didn't do anything. Now, right when this is happening, where he refuses to do anything, the people in this tax district, the property owners, were all enraged at him because he told them once the railroad was gone that their property values were going to skyrocket. Instead, the property values tanked out over here, and it became like an economic no-fly zone for the next 70 years because there was no transportation access. So he was in his office one day at the foot of Atlantic Avenue counting his money. Right then, a bunch of angry property owners break in with ropes and shotguns to lynch him and hang him. So, after a 4 or 5 hour gunfight goes by, according to the legend, Litchfield catches the ferry, he escapes, he catches the ferry, and he goes south.